Beyond Rome's northern frontier lived warrior priests who drank from human skulls and worshipped the wolf. When Emperor Trajan marched against these mountain dwellers in 101 AD, he faced not just fierce fighters, but an entire civilization that had mastered both metallurgy and mystery. King Decebalus transformed Carpathian peaks into fortresses and valleys into traps, defying Rome with tactical brilliance that demanded Rome's longest bridge and bloodiest campaign. Though their golden treasures vanished beneath river waters and their sacred wisdom burned with their temples, the Dacians left one eternal legacy. Even conquered peoples survive in stone, immortalized on Trajan's column, where victors unwittingly preserved the very culture they destroyed. The story of the Dacians begins long before their name was ever spoken, in a land cradled by mountains and rivers, where mist clung to the fir trees and smoke curled above valley hearths. The Carpathian Basin was already ancient when the first shepherds and potters settled its slopes. Between the Tisa and the Prut, human hands learned the rhythm of the soil, carving homes from clay and memory. They left behind a constellation of villages, Cucuteni, Tripilia, Vincia, whose patterned vessels and burnished idols tell of a people who lived with ceremony in their every gesture. In those early millennia, the Carpathians were not a frontier, but a heartland. Forests of beech and pine wrapped around fertile plains, where rivers glittered with bronze and gold. Here, communities built not cities, but sanctuaries of earth and fire. The potter's wheels spun beside the furnace. Ochre-colored figurines of women stood on house altars, guardians of birth and harvest. The people painted their homes in spirals and eyes, as if to remind the gods that mortals were watching back. Beneath their hands, a world of pattern and purpose emerged, a prelude to the civilizations that would later claim the mountains. From these Neolithic hearths, the Great Bronze Age dawned like the glint of dawn over snow-capped ridges. Metallurgy was its heartbeat. Villagers became smiths, and smiths became something like priests. At Pasica and Ottomani, they raised fortresses with ditches and palisades, defending their settlements as if guarding a sacred craft. Bronze, drawn from the veins of the earth, carried the weight of power and prestige. Axes, ornaments, and blades moved along the rivers as tribute and trade, proof that these mountain peoples were no longer isolated tribes, but participants in a wider human drama, stretching from the Aegean to the Baltic. Across the high plains, smoke from forges rose like prayers. In the workshops of Transylvania, artisans alloyed copper and tin with practiced precision. They shaped tools that could fell forests, weapons that gleamed like fire, and jewelry meant for leaders whose graves were richer than those of their kin. At Wittenberg, in the heart of what would become Dacia, archaeologists would one day uncover traces of this transformation, a culture that lived by metal and defended its mastery with walls of stone and earth. These fortified settlements were not random acts of fear. They were expressions of ambition. Each rampart, each watchtower, was a declaration that the Carpathian world could hold its own against the tempests of time. Trade routes wound through the passes, linking these lands to distant kingdoms. Amber from the Baltic, obsidian from the Carpathians, salt from Transylvania, all flowed like lifeblood through networks of barter and alliance. In this movement of goods came the movement of words and myths. Languages shifted, gods migrated. The foundations of what would one day be called Dacian were being laid, syllable by syllable, across the tongues of shepherds and traders. Through these centuries, migrations stirred the vast plain beyond the mountains. From the steppes to the east came riders, with long hair and sharper weapons, bringing with them the first strains of the Indo-European tongues. They were not conquerors in a single wave, but a slow tide that reshaped the landscape of peoples. Some merged with those already settled in the valleys. Others pressed further west. In the mingling of their blood and language arose new tribal identities, fragile, shifting, but persistent as the river stones that marked their boundaries. The Carpathians stood at the crossroads of this human tide. They were both barrier and meeting place. Those who entered found refuge and isolation. Those who left carried mountain legends down into the plains. The rhythms of life here were slower, more deliberate. A hilltop might be fortified not for war but for ceremony. A bronze dagger might serve both as weapon and offering. The people of the mountains learned to speak to their gods through smoke and song. They buried their dead with care, laying down cups and weapons as if equipping them for a journey beyond. In time, this spiritual depth would shape the identity of their descendants. The worship of the earth and sky, the reverence for ancestors, the sense that death was a crossing rather than an end. All of it would echo later in the cults of Zalmoxis, the mysterious god-philosopher of the Getae. But even in these prehistoric centuries, before names like Dacian or Getic existed, there was already a unity of spirit in the Carpathian world. It was a unity born not of empire, but of endurance. By 1800 BC, the Wittenberg culture flourished across Transylvania, its artisans leaving behind fine ceramics incised with spirals and lines, its warriors buried with bronze swords of formidable craftsmanship. Their hill forts, perched above rivers and plains, dominated the landscape. At places like Dershida and Sigishora, ramparts still whisper of communities organized, disciplined, and proud. These were not nomads, but proto-urban builders, a people accustomed to permanence. Their palisades guarded not just homes, but hierarchies. Chiefs and smiths, priests and warriors, each played a role in a society where the sacred and the practical were inseparable. Meanwhile, beyond the mountains, civilizations rose and fell. The Mycenaeans built palaces in the Aegean, the Hittites forged empires in Anatolia, and the Assyrians learned to harness iron. Yet the Carpathian tribes endured in their own rhythm, neither absorbed nor destroyed. They were the watchers on the edge of the known world, looking southward toward lands of marble and myth, but rooted in forests older than either. Trade with these southern realms deepened as bronze gave way to iron. Greek merchants, sailing up the Black Sea coast, would later record faint rumors of the peoples who lived beyond the Istros, the river the Romans would call the Danube. Even before their first encounter, the world knew something of these mountain folk, their stubbornness, their pride, their skill in metal and war. It was through these early contacts that the foundations of Dacian identity began to crystallize. In the shadows of the mountains, tribal alliances grew, families intermarried, and chieftains negotiated through feasts and oaths. A man's authority was measured not only in warriors, but in cattle, bronze, and sacred lineage. Women, too, held ritual importance. The mother figurines of earlier ages had become symbols of fertility and continuity, woven into songs that blessed the land each spring. To be born among the Carpathians was to inherit a dialogue between man and nature, a pact sealed in stone and soil. It was during this Bronze Age that the first echoes of legend appeared, fragments preserved later by Greek imagination. They spoke of fierce northern tribes whose kings spoke to gods in caves, whose warriors believed they could not die. Such tales, distorted by distance, carried a kernel of truth. The people of the Carpathians did live with the certainty that the world beyond the mountains was not entirely human. that divinity lingered in the mist. By 1200 BC, as the great Bronze Age civilizations of the eastern Mediterranean faltered, the Carpathian world also trembled. Fortresses were burned, settlements abandoned. Climatic shifts, raids from the steppe, and the exhaustion of metal veins all played their part. Yet even as destruction swept across Europe, the mountain tribes endured once more. Their strongholds shrank, but their traditions survived. The knowledge of bronze gave way to the secrets of iron, and from that dark soil would soon rise the ancestors of the Getae and Dacians, the heirs of 1,000 years of resilience. When we look back across the long twilight of prehistory, we do not find empires or chronicles in this land, only echoes, a shard of painted pottery, a burnt post hole, a grave filled with the gleam of ancient bronze. But from these fragments, a lineage can be traced. The Carpathians had become more than geography. They were a crucible. They forged a people hardened by isolation, devoted to ritual, and bound to the mountains that sheltered them. Long before their warriors faced Rome on the Danube, before Decebalus or Burebista carved their names into memory, the soul of Dacia was already taking shape. It was there, in the smoke of Bronze Age hearths, in the shimmer of molten metal, in the quiet defiance of those who built fortresses against the world's uncertainty. The Dacians would inherit not just a land, but a legacy, a sense that the mountains themselves were alive, watching, waiting for the age when their children would give them a name. When the storms of the late Bronze Age broke across Europe, the mountains of the Carpathians endured as they always had, vast, dark, and patient. Peoples came and went along their fringes, yet the high forests kept their secrets. What rose from the embers of that collapse was not silence, but renewal. Villages rebuilt on the old fortresses. Bronze turned to iron. Songs once whispered to household gods now echoed in the open air. Out of these scattered communities emerged a broader kinship, a web of tribes whose language, customs, and myths marked them as kin to the Thracians further south. The Thracians were not a single nation, but a chorus of tongues. Their lands stretched from the Aegean to the northern banks of the Danube, from the Black Sea to the ridges of the Balkan Range. They were herders, warriors, traders, and poets, each tribe fierce in its independence, bound together by what outsiders saw as a shared strangeness. To the Greeks who later encountered them, the Thracians were both barbarous and noble, swift horsemen who drank from gilded cups, and seers who spoke to the gods through frenzy and fire. North of them, in the plains and foothills of what is now Romania, their cousins lived, tribes known to later writers as the Getae. They were not yet the Dacians, but they carried within them the same mountain blood. Their tongues shared the cadence of Thracian speech, though their lives were shaped by a harsher climate and wilder terrain. The Getae hunted along the rivers, kept herds on the high meadows, and fortified their settlements with rings of stone and timber. They were the watchers of the northern frontier of Thrace, a world poised between forest and steppe. The memory of the old Bronze Age still lingered among them. Iron now replaced bronze, but the habits of craftsmanship remained. Blades forged in the smoky forges of the Carpathians gleamed with a darker light. Artisans hammered shields adorned with spirals and beasts, designs that spoke to their faith in transformation, the eternal circle of life and death. Their warriors, tattooed and braided, carried these symbols into battle. To die with such markings was to be remembered by the tribe, to walk among ancestors whose spirits dwelled in the mountains. In the wider Balkans, change was unrelenting. The fall of Mycenae and Troy had reshuffled the ancient world. The Greek city-states began to rise along the coasts, while to the north, new tribes pressed against older ones, Cimmerians, Phrygians, Scythians, each bringing new weapons and new fears. Amid this turbulence, the Thracian-speaking peoples adapted rather than vanished. They absorbed the newcomers, traded where they could, fought when they must. The northern tribes along the Danube learned to survive in the shadow of empires not yet born. The earliest glimpses we have of them come not from their own voices, but from those of outsiders. The Greeks, reaching northward in their restless curiosity, began to record what they saw, or thought they saw. In the songs attributed to Homer, Thracians appear as allies of Troy, fierce riders from the mountains, slain by Achilles on the night before dawn. It was myth, yet myth had roots in memory. These northern tribes had long traded with the Aegean world, exchanging amber and hides for wine, oil, and ornaments. To the seafarers of the south, they seemed both near and remote, neighbors at the edge of mystery. Centuries later, Herodotus would write of them with fascination. He called the Thracians the most numerous of all peoples after the Indians, scattered into countless tribes, each jealous of its own customs. He described the Getae, the northernmost of them, as men who believed they did not die, but joined their god in the afterlife. Even through the filter of Greek imagination, one hears the echo of a real faith, an early form of the immortality cult that would define Dacian religion in later ages. The world of the Getae was not isolated. The Black Sea coast became a corridor of contact. Greek colonies such as Histria, Tomis, and Odessos appeared in the 7th century BC, founded by settlers from Miletus. They brought wine, amphorae, olive oil, and stories of distant gods. The Getae, in turn, offered grain, furs, and slaves. This exchange was more than commercial, it was cultural. The tribes of the north began to see themselves reflected in the polished bronze mirrors of the Greeks, and the Greeks, for their part, came to imagine the lands beyond the Danube as a place of prophets and warriors. Before those colonies took root, however, the Getae had already forged a distinctive way of life. Their society revolved around fortified hilltop settlements, small, self-contained communities that balanced defense and ritual. A chieftain ruled through council and kinship, guided by the council of priests who interpreted omens in the flight of birds and the smoke of offerings. To these people, every mountain peak was sacred, every river alive with spirits. The Carpathians were not simply home, they were divine architecture. The warrior aristocracies that emerged in this period gave the northern Thracians both strength and structure. Wealth flowed from raiding and trade, but power came from charisma and courage. A chief was expected to lead from the front, to feast his men, to honor the gods lavishly. Graves from this age, buried beneath mounds of stone, reveal the same story written in iron. Swords, spearheads, harness fittings, gold rings. Women, too, were interred with ornaments and mirrors, suggesting that prestige in these societies was shared, not hoarded. To the west, Celtic tribes would soon begin their long migration into Central Europe, bringing with them new designs and new gods. To the east, the Scythians spread across the steppe, their horses stamping frost from the earth. Between these rising powers, the Thracians and Getae stood like a bridge between worlds. Their culture absorbed influences yet remained distinct. Mountain-born, ritual-bound, proud of its isolation. The seeds of what would become Dacian strength lay in this stubborn adaptability. It was in these centuries that a common identity began to take form. The northern tribes spoke dialects of the same tongue. worshipped similar gods and shared the same patterns of burial and art. They traded along the same rivers, fought under similar banners, and told stories drawn from the same ancestral stock. The Carpathians had woven them together, not as an empire, but as a tapestry of tribes bound by geography and faith. When the Greek historian later wrote of the Getae as the bravest and most just of the Thracians, he captured something the mountains had long known, that the people who endured there were shaped as much by their land as by their lineage. The mountains demanded endurance, the plains invited danger, the rivers offered passage and peril in equal measure. To live between them required a balance of ferocity and restraint. It was a balance the Getae mastered. By the end of this age, roughly 6 centuries before the birth of Christ, the line between Thracian and Dacian was already beginning to blur and shift. The northern tribes had developed their own dialects, their own styles of fortification, their own gods of the hills and skies. The Greeks called them Getae, the Romans later Dacians, but the people themselves knew only that they were children of the mountains. Their world was one of iron and oath, of feasts beside the fire, and battles fought for honor more than conquest. The old Bronze Age traditions had not vanished. They had deepened. The spiral patterns carved into pottery still wound toward eternity. The reverence for ancestors still guided every burial. The belief in unseen powers, gods who walked among men, heroes who never truly died, remained the heartbeat of their faith. From such foundations, the story of Dacia would rise, carrying forward both the weight of history and the promise of legend. By the dawn of the 6th century BC, the lands north of the Danube had begun to find their rhythm again. Fortified villages clung to the high ridges of Transylvania and Moldavia, their watchfires burning through nights heavy with mist. The Getae, those northern kin of the Thracians, had become more than scattered tribes. They were now a constellation of peoples, loosely bound by speech, belief, and blood. From their mountain strongholds, they looked southward toward the plains where Greek merchants had begun to settle the Black Sea coast. Between these two worlds, Greek and Getic, lay a frontier of barter, curiosity, and war. Across the lower Danube, Greek sailors from Miletus and other Ionian cities established colonies such as Histria, Tomis, and Calatis. They came seeking grain, hides, and honey, but found something more profound, a civilization in embryo. The Getae traded willingly, offering salted meat, amber, and slaves in return for amphorae of oil and wine. Through these exchanges, they absorbed fragments of the Hellenic world, new designs for weapons, new styles of ornament, and perhaps most transformative of all, new ideas about gods and mortality. Yet the Getae were not passive recipients of foreign wisdom. They interpreted every import, material or spiritual, through the prism of their own mountain faith. Among them, belief was no abstract matter, but the fabric of daily life. At the heart of this faith stood Zalmoxis, a mysterious figure whose name echoed through both myth and history. Later writers would call him a god, a prophet, even a philosopher. According to one Greek tale, he had once been a slave of Pythagoras, returning north to preach the immortality of the soul to his astonished people. To the Getae, he was far older and nearer than that. A mortal who had walked among them, entered the underworld, and returned to teach that death was not an end, but a doorway. Each generation retold the story in its own voice. Some said Zalmoxis had vanished into a sacred cave in the mountains, living there as a hermit until lightning announced his ascension. Others claimed he had built a hall of feasts where he taught men to live in purity, to master fear, to greet death with calm. His priests, interpreting his words, urged warriors to courage and restraint. To die bravely was to awaken. To live dishonorably was to be truly lost. It was a creed that would make the Getae formidable opponents in every age that followed. Herodotus, who visited their world in the 5th century BC, wrote of them with astonishment. He described how they believed themselves immortal and sent messengers to their god by casting them upon the points of spears. Ritual sacrifice transformed into divine correspondence. To his Greek mind, it was barbaric mysticism. Yet within that rite lay a profound spiritual order, a conviction that life and death were threads of the same cloth. For the Getae, this belief was both comfort and weapon. A man who does not fear death cannot easily be conquered. Their settlements reflected this dual nature of piety and power. The hill forts of the Getae were more than refugees. They were statements of permanence. Built upon high plateaus and ridges, they commanded the valleys below. Inside their timber palisades, circular huts clustered around central sanctuaries. Smoke rose from altars where offerings of grain, wine, and the first fruits of the hunt were made to the gods. Warriors stored their arms beside sacred fires, and the boundaries between the religious and the political blurred completely. To rule among the Getae was to mediate between men and heaven. Southward, the Persian Empire began its vast expansion under Darius the Great. Around 514 BC, his armies crossed the Bosporus, marching into the Balkans in pursuit of the elusive Scythians. In his path lay the tribes of Thrace and the Getae. Herodotus tells us that while many submitted without resistance, the Getae alone dared to fight. Their king, remembered as Charnabon, mustered his warriors to face the invader. They were outmatched in numbers and arms, yet their defiance left an impression even on their conquerors. When they were finally subdued, Darius spared them, a gesture of respect for their courage. The encounter was brief, but it announced the Getae to history, mountain warriors whose faith made them fearless. After the Persians withdrew, the Getae recovered swiftly. Their autonomy deepened, their networks expanded. Trade with the Greek colonies grew richer, bringing not only goods, but literacy, art, and knowledge of the wider world. Greek artisans settled among them, and Getic craftsmen adopted foreign motifs, spirals, rosettes, and mythic beasts, but infused them with native vigor. Bronze cauldrons and gold ornaments discovered in burial mounds along the Danube bear witness to this fusion. Thracian in spirit, Hellenic in touch. The result was a visual language that proclaimed both sophistication and independence. By the 4th century BC, the Getae were a power to reckon with. Their kings ruled from hilltop fortresses overlooking the river, maintaining alliances through marriage, gift, and ritual. Chieftains gathered around them, bound by oaths sworn over shared wine and sacrificed horses. War bands roamed the plains, raiding the Scythians to the east and the Celtic newcomers pressing from the west. Yet for all their ferocity, the Getae were not merely raiders. They built roads through the forests, bridges over rivers, and storehouses for trade goods. Their society, though tribal, possessed an order that hinted at future kingdoms. Greek chroniclers, whose ships carried both commerce and curiosity, began to speak of these northern peoples with admiration. They noted their tall stature, their courage, and their devotion to discipline. The Getae, it was said, drank less wine than other Thracians and lived more simply, as though purity were a shield against decadence. Such restraint impressed outsiders, even as their raids terrified them. Along the Black Sea, coastal cities learned that peace with the Getae was best maintained through gifts and respect. One story captured the imagination of the Greek world. the clash between the Getic king Dromicates and the Macedonian ruler Lysimachus, successor of Alexander the Great. Around 292 BC, Lysimachus crossed the Danube, seeking to subdue the tribes beyond it. But the campaign turned to disaster. The Getae ambushed his forces, captured the king himself, and brought him in chains before Dromicates. Rather than kill him, the Getic ruler invited his captive to a feast. He showed the Macedonians the simple fare of his people: meat roasted on spits, wooden cups filled with water, and then contrasted it with the gold and silver luxuries the invaders had lost. Why, he asked, should men who live amid plenty seek to rob those who have little? Ashamed and impressed, Lysimachus accepted peace, swearing friendship. The tale, whether embellished or true, reveals the self-image of the Getae, a people proud of simplicity, disdainful of greed, guided by justice and courage. They were not barbarians, but guardians of an older virtue the Greeks themselves feared they had lost. In that legend of generosity and restraint lies the first glimmer of what would later define Dacian kingship, a fusion of moral authority and military strength. By the end of the 4th century BC, the world of the Getae stretched from the lower Danube to the foothills of the Carpathians. Their influence rippled through the lands beyond, touching both Scythian steppe and Thracian plain. They stood poised between the civilized and the untamed, heirs to both worlds, yet beholden to neither. The Greeks saw in them an echo of their own heroic age, men who lived by courage and faith, bound not by empire, but by honor. From their fortified hills, the Getae looked out over a horizon alive with change. The Celts were advancing from the west, the Macedonians consolidating their power in the south, and the Scythians still prowled the eastern plains. Yet the Getae endured, sustained by a belief stronger than any sword, that death was merely another path through the mountain mist. In that faith lay the endurance of a people who, in centuries to come, would forge the kingdom of Dacia and challenge the might of Rome itself. The Carpathians, dark and immense, had long been the spine of an unnamed world. By the 4th century BC, their valleys hummed with life, herders calling to their flocks, smiths striking iron upon stone, sentinels pacing the ramparts of fortresses that dotted the ridges like a chain of watchful eyes. Out of this rugged landscape, a new identity was stirring. The Getae of the lower Danube and the mountain tribes of Transylvania were no longer merely kin. They were evolving into something distinct, something that would one day bear the name Dacian. This was an age of definition. Across Europe, cultures blurred, merged, and hardened into new forms. The Celts, restless and daring, swept eastward from the Rhine, carrying with them the gleam of Latène artistry, spirals and curves, iron blades of superb craftsmanship, and the concept of chieftain-led confederations bound by oath rather than blood. The Carpathian tribes, though fierce defenders of their autonomy, could not remain untouched. They traded with the newcomers, fought them, learned from them. In the smoky forges of Transylvania, Dacian smiths adopted Celtic techniques, melding them with local tradition to forge weapons that were both deadly and beautiful. In the river valleys, iron replaced bronze as the measure of wealth and power. The art of the smith had become the art of kingship. A man's prestige was not only in his herds or his warriors, but in the blade he bore, the torque upon his neck, the shield embossed with intricate designs that told of lineage and victory. At workshops near places later called Kugir and Sarmizegetusa, iron was smelted in clay furnaces that glowed red through the night, their smoke mingling with mountain fog. Out of that fusion of earth, fire, and ambition, the material culture of the Dacians began to take form, refined, distinct, unmistakable. Across the hills, fortresses multiplied. No longer were they simple stockades of timber. They became complex citadels with concentric walls and stone reinforcements, an innovation that would reach its peak in the later murus Dacicus technique. Each fort marked both a refuge and a statement of identity, a claim to permanence amid a shifting world. These strongholds, perched above river confluences and passes, were the first architectural expressions of Dacian unity. They guarded trade routes, stored grain, and served as centers of worship and judgment. Within their walls, warriors trained, priests offered libations to the gods of earth and sky, and messengers carried news across the mountains. Religion remained the heartbeat of these communities. The faith of the Getae, centered on Zalmoxis and the promise of immortality, had deepened, branching into regional forms. In the highlands of Transylvania, sanctuaries appeared, circles of stone where priests watched the stars and read meaning in the rhythm of the seasons. The mountain was itself a temple, its peaks seen as ladders between the human and the divine. The Dacians inherited that faith and gave it structure. Priests, known for their austerity, guided kings and councils. Their council could halt a war or consecrate one. To defy them was to invite the wrath of the gods, a lesson no chieftain soon forgot. Beneath this sacred order, politics grew ever more intricate. Tribes that once fought over pastures began to form alliances. Marriage pacts linked valleys and riverlands. Tribute and trade bound distant fortresses. In the lowlands, the Getae remained powerful. Their eyes turned toward the Danube and the Greek cities beyond it. In the highlands, the Dacian tribes consolidated under emerging leaders who prized discipline and defense. The result was not yet a kingdom, but a confederation, a web of loyalties strong enough to resist external conquest, yet flexible enough to survive internal rivalry. To the south, Macedon's shadow loomed large. Alexander the Great's successors sought to extend their influence north of the Haemus Mountains. They sent emissaries to the Getae, demanding tribute or alliance. One campaign ended disastrously. A Macedonian force crossing the Danube found itself surrounded by swift horsemen and disciplined infantry, forced to sue for peace. To the chroniclers of the Hellenistic world, these northern warriors were a curiosity, half barbarian, half philosopher, as if the wilds themselves had bred a people immune to fear. It was around this time that the distinction between Getae and Dacians began to solidify in the language of outsiders. The Greeks spoke of the Getae along the lower Danube. The later Romans would call those in the mountain heartland Dacians. Yet to the people themselves, no such boundary existed. The rivers were their roads, the mountains their walls, and the gods their common inheritance. What bound them together was not administration or empire, but a shared rhythm of life, a fusion of warrior discipline, agricultural steadiness, and spiritual conviction. Their art revealed as much as their weapons. Dacian metalworkers, inheriting both Thracian motifs and Celtic curves, created jewelry that shimmered with movement, fibulae shaped like coiled serpents, bracelets with ends that met in dragon heads, swords whose hilts bore intricate engravings of sun and spiral. These designs spoke of continuity, the eternal turning of the heavens, the cycle of life and death. Even in ornament, the Dacians expressed the cosmology that guided their faith. As trade increased, so too did the flow of ideas. Greek merchants along the coast spoke of city-states and monarchs who ruled by law. Celtic wanderers brought tales of druids and distant isles. Scythian riders from the steppe carried stories of gods who demanded courage above all. The Dacians listened but did not imitate. Their wisdom lay in synthesis, adopting what strengthened them, discarding what weakened them. From the Celts, they took artistry. From the Greeks, the art of treaty. From the Scythians, the mastery of cavalry. From their own past, they took endurance. Raids and skirmishes were constant, but so too was diplomacy. A Dacian chieftain might one season send envoys with gifts to Macedon, and the next lead his men in a raid across the same frontier. The balance between peace and conflict was delicate, yet it kept their confederations agile and their enemies uncertain. Through such pragmatism, the Dacians preserved their autonomy at a time when larger powers consumed their neighbors. By 350 BC, the outlines of a people were clear. In the mountains, fortified citadels, such as those later discovered at Kostest and Blidaru, dominated the landscape. Their walls, built with geometric precision, suggest centralized authority and skilled engineering, signs of a society already thinking beyond the tribe. At feasts, chiefs sat upon carved wooden thrones, drinking mead from horn cups as bards recited the deeds of ancestors who had stood against Persia, Scythia, and Macedon alike. This new confidence found expression in their rituals. Burial mounds grew grander and offerings to the gods more elaborate. A warrior might be buried with his sword and horse, his spirit guided to the next world by priests chanting the hymns of Zalmoxis. Even in death, hierarchy persisted, but so did hope. The Dacians believed their souls would return, reborn among kin, forever part of the mountains. To the outside world, they remained elusive, half hidden behind the forests. Yet their reputation spread. Greek traders wrote of disciplined warriors who held their drink and their temper, of priests who ruled by reason rather than fear, of fortresses built in stone while others still used timber. The Dacians were becoming, in the eyes of their neighbors, a distinct civilization. Wild, yes, but guided by order. As the century drew to a close, change gathered like thunder beyond the passes. The Celts pushed further east, the Scythians waned, and the Macedonians turned their gaze once more toward the Danube. Among the mountain strongholds, the Dacians prepared. They had been shaped by centuries of blending, Thracian blood, Celtic craft, Scythian grit, and now stood ready to step onto the stage of history as a people united by both land and legend. Their time was coming. Soon kings would rise among them, men whose ambition matched the mountains they ruled. But before that age of empire, there was this, an awakening, quiet yet immense, as a nameless people began to call themselves one. In the forges of Transylvania and the temples of the high valleys, Dacia was being born. Once the sentinels of feuding tribes, the mountains now stood witness to the slow awakening of a nation. By the 3rd century BC, Dacia had found its heartbeat, a rhythm of forges, fortresses, and ambition. The Carpathians were no longer a refuge, they were an anvil. Every valley seemed alive with the clang of iron and the murmur of warriors drilling beneath the banners of new kings. Iron had changed everything. Once, bronze was a luxury, and strength came from numbers. Now mastery lay in fire. The smiths of the mountains were treated like prophets, their furnaces glowing through the night, while the wind carried the tang of ore. Out of those flames came curved falx blades, lean and merciless. Men swore they were shaped after lightning itself, swift, blinding, impossible to parry. A Dacian warrior, blade in hand, felt himself part of a divine order, a servant of Zalmoxis whose courage was his prayer. Above the rivers, citadels rose from stone. The Murus Daciacus, perfected in this age, gave their strongholds a permanence rare among tribal peoples. Massive walls of limestone and timber, locked together in complex patterns, crowned the ridges of Transylvania. Each fortress was more than a refuge. It was a statement. Within those walls were granaries, sanctuaries, and workshops. At their gates, elders sat in council beside soldiers. Smoke from hearths and forges mingled in the air, blurring the line between daily labor and sacred act. Power had begun to consolidate. The days of scattered chieftains were fading, replaced by kings whose authority reached from valley to valley. One such ruler, remembered as King Orals, became a legend among his people. When his soldiers failed to stand against the Bastanae, he condemned them not with death, but humiliation, ordering them to serve their wives as masters until their shame was washed away in victory. When the Bastanae returned, the Dacians fought like men possessed, and the tale lived on as a parable of discipline reborn from disgrace. Farther north, Celtic tribes pressed toward the Carpathians, restless wanderers from the heart of Europe. At first, clashes were fierce. Raids, ambushes, and skirmishes fought over pastures and mines. Yet over time, hostility turned to exchange. The Dacians studied the newcomers' artistry and absorbed their techniques. From Celtic craftsmen, they learned finer ways to twist gold and carve designs into iron. Their own smiths transformed these lessons into something unmistakably Dacian. Torque necklaces ending in serpent heads, swords balanced for speed rather than weight, and shields that bore intricate spirals recalling both Celtic grace and Thracian power. Southward, Macedonia's grasp on the Balkans weakened. Successor kings of Alexander the Great struggled for dominance, and their wars sent ripples through the Danube frontier. Dacian emissaries, wary but curious, crossed into those lands of marble palaces and new gods. They returned with tales of decadence and decay, a world rich in art but poor in restraint. In contrast, the Dacians prized simplicity, clean lines, hard iron, steady hearts. They looked upon the feuds of the Hellenistic kingdoms and saw cautionary tales. Within their own lands, unity deepened. Fortresses were linked by routes that followed rivers and ridges, carrying messengers between distant citadels. At each capital, councils of elders met beside sanctuaries, where sacred fires burned continuously. Kings ruled, but priests of Zalmoxis remained the moral axis. They advised restraint when pride ran high, demanded purification before war, and warned that victory without justice invited divine ruin. Through their influence, Dacian kingship took on a spiritual gravity. A ruler was not merely a warlord, but a mediator between the living and the gods. In this era of consolidation, Rubabostes emerged as a figure of remarkable vision. He expanded his dominion from Transylvania's heart outward, uniting scattered tribes under a single banner. His campaigns against the Celts were remembered less for slaughter than for precision, swift strikes that asserted dominance without destroying the land. Rubabostes seemed to understand that power gained through ruin was fleeting. He built where others burned, binding his conquests through loyalty rather than terror. In the shadow of his reign, Dacian society flourished in subtle ways. The arts of carving and metalwork reached new heights. Artisans fashioned ritual vessels of bronze and gold, decorated with sunbursts and animal forms that mirrored celestial myths. Pottery, once coarse, became refined and symmetrical, its patterns echoing the geometry of fortress walls. Women of rank wore jewelry inlaid with coral and glass beads brought from distant coasts. The beauty of their world was not ostentatious. It was disciplined, rhythmic, shaped by the same precision that built their walls and swords. Religious life followed this order. Zalmoxis remained the supreme figure, but lesser deities of water, sky, and hearth thrived beneath him. The mountains themselves were treated as living beings, veined with the spirits of ancestors. Pilgrimages to high peaks marked the seasons, and warriors fasted before climbing to offer thanks or plea. These rites bound the tribes in shared rhythm. They reminded each man that his life was part of something older than blood. Though distant, the Roman Republic's rise did not go unnoticed. Travelers returning from the Balkans brought stories of a disciplined people whose power lay in organization rather than mysticism. The Dacians listened, curious yet unthreatened. Rome's reach had not yet touched the Carpathians, and for a generation, Dacia prospered in relative peace. But even in tranquility, the kings sensed change gathering beyond the horizon. The Danube frontier was no longer the world's edge. It was becoming a stage for ambition. Orals and Rubabostes, whether remembered faithfully or not, left behind something greater than victories. They left an idea of Dacian sovereignty. Under them, the confederations began to act with unity. Fortresses no longer fought as rivals, but as limbs of a single body. Messengers carried decrees sealed with royal insignia, and warriors from far-flung valleys answered the same summons. The Dacians were learning the language of kingship. Beyond their borders, observers began to notice. Greek chroniclers wrote of a northern people with strange virtues, fearless yet measured, fierce yet organized, guided by faith in the immortality of the soul. They saw in the Dacians a reflection of their own heroic past, a people still uncorrupted by wealth, still bound to the land and to gods who demanded courage above all. By 200 BC, Dacia was no longer a whisper in the mountains. It had become a realm of fortresses and fields, of miners and priests, of kings who dreamed beyond their valleys. Their power was neither sudden nor accidental. It had risen slowly, layer by layer, like the stone walls that circled their citadels. What the outside world saw as wilderness was, to them, a living kingdom, one forged in silence, tempered by fire, and bound by the belief that even death could not undo their unity. The silence that had once cloaked Dacia was gone. Across the highlands, roads clattered with hoofbeats and the ring of iron. Smoke rose from forges, and voices shouted in a single tongue. The mountains, long divided by rival chieftains, now obeyed one command. Out of that rugged world had emerged a ruler unlike any before him, a man whose power would rival kings and whose vision would reshape his people. His name was Burebista. He rose in an age of fracture. Macedon had fallen into decline. Celtic warbands, once fierce and wandering, were scattered or absorbed. And far to the south, Rome, mighty yet distracted, tore itself apart in civil war. In this chaos, Burebista saw not danger, but destiny. He was no opportunist, but a craftsman of nations, a man who believed the Dacians could be something greater than tribes bound by superstition and pride. To the chieftains who met him, he seemed touched by the divine, calm where others raged, relentless where others hesitated. From his seat in the Orashti Mountains, most likely at Samizegatusa, he began the slow transformation of Dacia from confederation to kingdom. He gathered his advisors, priests, warriors, seers, and builders, and imposed a discipline that startled even his own followers. Guided by Decebalus, the priest-philosopher whose reputation for wisdom bordered on myth, Burebista sought to cleanse his people of weakness. Drunkenness was outlawed, idleness condemned, greed branded as blasphemy. Vineyards were uprooted, wine poured into the soil as offering and warning. To outsiders, these acts seemed madness. To the Dacians, they were revelation. Decebalus gave shape to this new order. He reorganized the priesthood into a hierarchy that mirrored the kingdom itself. Elders who read the stars, seers who interpreted dreams, and novices who learned the secret chants of Zalmoxis. He taught that strength began within, that self-control was a weapon sharper than iron. Burebista listened, and together they wove a covenant between the divine and the mortal. The temples became the heart of government, the priesthood its conscience. Law and faith moved as one. Through this unity of belief and rule, the Dacians found purpose. The fortresses of Transylvania, once guarded by suspicious rivals, now formed a network of command and defense. Watchtowers linked the valleys. Signal fires blazed from ridge to ridge, carrying messages faster than any rider. The Murus Dacius walls were reinforced with new stone and timber, their geometry reflecting not only military precision but spiritual order. Inside those walls, artisans forged weapons of elegant lethality, curved falx blades, iron-tipped spears, and armor inlaid with symbols of the sun and serpent. To wield such arms was not only to fight for Dacia, but to serve the gods themselves. The scale of Burebista's ambition astonished even his enemies. Strabo would later write that the Dacian king could call upon 200,000 warriors, a number the Greeks dismissed as impossible, yet found plausible all the same. His banners advanced in every direction. In the west, he crushed the Boiai and Taurishi, securing control of the Carpathian basin. In the east, he subdued the tribes along the Dniester and bent them to his will. To the south, he marched to the shores of the Black Sea, where Greek cities that had long traded with the Dacians were forced to choose between submission and ruin. The fall of the coastal cities was not an act of simple conquest. To Burebista, they represented corruption, colonies of indulgence whose wealth softened the frontier. Olbia, Tyrus, and Histria, centers of luxury, their markets filled with wine and gold, were razed or brought under strict control. Their temples to foreign gods were dismantled, and their merchants made to pay tribute to the Dacian crown. In place of indulgence came austerity. In place of profit, obedience. Even Rome took notice. Julius Caesar, already dreaming of further glory after Gaul, learned of this northern monarch who had forged an empire of his own. Reports from traders and scouts spoke of disciplined armies, fortified cities, and a priestly ruler who combined religion and strategy as if born for both. Caesar planned an expedition against him, perhaps to secure the Danube frontier, perhaps to eliminate a rival whose growing strength unsettled him. But before he could act, civil war erupted between Caesar and Pompey. The legions turned inward, and Burebista's northern empire continued unchallenged. Within Dacia, the transformation was total. Roads cut through forests where no path had been before. Bridges spanned rivers once impassable. Grain moved from the plains to the mountains, iron from the mines to the workshops, salt from Transylvania to distant allies. Yet what defined this new kingdom was not its economy, but its spirit. Every man was expected to live with the dignity of one chosen by the gods, every woman with the virtue of the earth that nourished them. The old cults of fertility and storm were folded into the greater worship of Zalmoxis, whose immortality promised not escape from death, but triumph over fear. The great fortress of Sarmizegetusa embodied this faith. Terraces carved into the mountain held temples aligned with the sun's rising, circles of stone that served as both observatories and sanctuaries. Priests in white garments studied the heavens, believing the stars recorded the will of the gods. Below them, soldiers drilled in courtyards where offerings burned before battles. Music and prayer mingled with the clang of training blades, and every ceremony reinforced the belief that to fight for Dacia was to act as an instrument of divine balance. But a realm born from discipline demanded perfect obedience, and Burebista's grip was unyielding. Chieftains who hesitated to bow were crushed. Fortresses that resisted were dismantled stone by stone, their leaders executed or driven into exile. Yet even his enemies could not deny the result. He had accomplished what centuries of kings had only imagined: a unified Dacia stretching from the Black Sea to the Middle Danube, from the Pannonian Plains to the forests of the north. By the late 40s BC, his kingdom rivaled the great powers of the Mediterranean. The Dacians had become a people of both faith and precision, soldiers who prayed before striking, artisans who treated beauty as a form of order, priests who guided rulers through visions. Their culture, once regional and rustic, now radiated confidence. Bronze cauldrons and golden bracelets bore designs of spirals and suns, the eternal symbols of Dacian harmony. They saw themselves as chosen, a people set apart, disciplined in body and pure in spirit. Yet even harmony can fracture under its own perfection. The moral severity that bound the kingdom also bred resentment. Some nobles whispered that the king had replaced freedom with sanctity, that his priests had become his spies. Others, weary of endless reform, longed for the revelry of earlier days. Still, few dared speak openly. The shadow of Burebista's authority stretched across the mountains like a storm that never broke. Beyond Dacia, Rome's fate turned on the edge of a knife. When word reached the north that Caesar had been murdered in 44 BC, Burebista's enemies saw their chance. The same nobles he had disciplined rose in conspiracy, striking before his loyal armies could respond. The king who had united the mountains fell to blades drawn in secret, betrayed by those who could not live under his stern peace. With his death, the great kingdom splintered. Dacia fractured into 4, then 5 realms, each led by men who claimed descent or legitimacy from the fallen ruler. The roads he built remained, the fortresses stood, but the voice that had bound them was silent. Yet even in disunion, the memory of his reign endured. Burebista's achievement went beyond conquest. He had proved that the Dacians could be one people, strong, disciplined, and guided by faith, rather than chaos. He gave them a vision of kingship, not as domination, but as stewardship, of religion, not as superstition, but as structure. The mountains he ruled kept his spirit. The temples he raised kept his law. When later generations rebuilt the kingdom under new rulers, they did so in his image. In the silence that followed his death, the Dacians did not forget. They still told stories of the king who had forbidden wine and conquered cities, who had spoken with priests as equals and commanded warriors as brothers. Burebista had turned a land of fortresses into a realm of destiny. His reign ended in betrayal, but his idea endured, that a people who conquered themselves could stand against any empire. When Burebista fell, the echo of his reign rolled through the mountains like distant thunder. His empire had been carved from faith and fire, held together by a single will. Without him, that will dissolve. The unity he had forged splintered into rival courts and wary alliances. Kings rose from among his former generals and governors, each claiming to carry his legacy, each guarded by their own stronghold. Dacia had not vanished, but it had fractured. The first decades after his death were years of uneasy survival. 4 kingdoms emerged at first, later 5, their borders shifting with every feud. In the east, the descendants of Rubabostes held sway along the Siret. In the south, near the Danube, other chieftains commanded the valleys that overlooked Rome's frontier. In Transylvania, the mountain fortresses clung to their independence with iron stubbornness. None possessed Burebista's authority, yet all borrowed his language of kingship, speaking of unity, invoking Zalmoxis, and building walls in imitation of his citadels. Among these rulers, the names of Decomes, Commosicus, Scorilo, and Duras survive in fragments of Roman record. They ruled not empires, but memories. Each sought to hold together a portion of the old realm through diplomacy, religion, or war. Commosicus, remembered as both priest and king, kept alive the spiritual discipline of Decianus, teaching that order must outlast power. Scorilo, later in the line, tried to steer between hostility and alliance with Rome, recognizing that the southern empire was now too vast to ignore. For the Dacians themselves, the age was one of endurance rather than conquest. The roads built under Burebista still ran through the valleys, carrying merchants and messengers, but where once they had bound provinces, they now marked borders between rival thrones. The great sanctuaries still gleamed on the ridges, yet their fires burned for different gods or different kings. And yet, despite all division, the people kept calling themselves one. The idea of Dacia, once spoken, refused to die. Beyond the mountains, the world changed. The Roman Republic collapsed into monarchy. Augustus, master of the Mediterranean, reorganized the provinces along the Danube, establishing Moesia as a buffer against the north. Roman forts appeared where the river bent, manned by legions whose banners glittered in the sun. Traders followed the soldiers, bringing glass, wine, and coin to the frontier towns. To many Dacians, this was not invasion, but temptation. They traded livestock and salt for silver, learning Roman ways, even as they swore never to bow to Roman rule. Skirmishes flared and faded like sparks on the frontier. Dacian raiders crossed the river under cover of night, seizing goods and prisoners. Roman generals responded with punitive expeditions that burned villages before withdrawing to their side of the Danube. These clashes taught both sides respect. The Romans found that the Dacians did not scatter like other tribes. They counterattacked with discipline, vanishing into forests that swallowed entire legions. As Rome consolidated its empire, the Dacians consolidated their resilience. They built new fortresses in the Transylvanian highlands, stone citadels at Costești, Blidaru, and Piatra Roșie, each commanding the passes into the heart of the mountains. Within their walls lived communities of soldiers, smiths, and priests, bound together by a shared sense of destiny. The architecture of these fortresses, with their distinctive Murus Daciacus walls, bore the mark of continuity from Burebista's time, a statement that even in disunity, their civilization remained intact. Religion, too, endured. The cult of Zalmoxis adapted to the age of uncertainty. Priests preached that the god's realm lay beyond death and division, that Dacia would rise again when its people remembered who they were. Offerings continued at mountain shrines, grain, wine, iron tools, and sometimes it was whispered, the blood of captives. Yet this faith was no longer centralized. Every kingdom had its own priestly circle, its own interpretation of the divine law. The Dacians were many voices speaking the same language, each insisting it spoke most clearly. The Romans, watching from the Danube, understood both the danger and the opportunity. They sent envoys bearing gifts to certain kings, securing alliances against others. For a time, this policy of balance kept the frontier quiet. The Emperor Augustus preferred negotiation to endless war, and Dacian kings accepted gold in return for peace. But gold could not buy pride. Raids resumed whenever Rome appeared weak, whenever famine or ambition stirred the tribes. By the middle of the 1st century AD, new leaders emerged among the Dacians who began to dream again of unity. Scorillo, perhaps a descendant of Burebista's house, ruled from the mountains with cautious dignity. He maintained uneasy diplomacy with Rome, sending envoys to the emperors Tiberius and Claudius, trading iron for luxury goods and keeping his warriors ready. His successor, Durus, inherited a kingdom weary of restraint. Under him, the Dacians began to test Rome's strength once more. In 62 AD, fortune favored them. On the lower Danube, Roman legions faced not the Dacians, but their Sarmatian neighbors, the Roxolani. In the snows of Histria, the Dacians intervened, swift, decisive, and ruthless. Their assault crushed the Sarmatians and astonished the Roman commanders who witnessed it. Word spread quickly through the frontier. The mountain warriors still remembered how to fight. The victory revived their confidence and rekindled the dream that Dacia could once again rise united. The years that followed were restless. Roman generals strengthened their forts along the Danube, wary of renewed Dacian aggression. Traders and spies carried news in both directions, of Roman legions shifting positions, of Dacian kings forging alliances with Sarmatians and free Thracians. It was an age of suspicion, yet also of connection. Every raid was followed by negotiation, every treaty by betrayal. The border was less a line than a conversation carried in sword and silver. Culturally, the Dacians absorbed as much as they resisted. Roman pottery appeared in their markets, Roman coinage in their treasuries. Some Dacian nobles adopted Latin inscriptions for their seals, while Roman soldiers carried home Dacian jewelry, spiraled bracelets, twisted torques, as trophies or charms. Exchange and enmity became indistinguishable. Still, within the mountains, the old heart of the kingdom beat on. The citadel of Sarmizegetusa remained sacred, a place where kings were crowned and priests observed the stars. The terraces of its temples filled again with worshippers during the festivals of Zalmoxis. At night, the sound of horns echoed across the valleys, a reminder that the Dacians had not forgotten Burebista's vision. But unity required more than memory. It required a leader capable of imposing it. None of the kings who followed possessed that combination of charisma and conviction. Their rule kept Dacia alive, yet not whole. They guarded the flame, but could not make it blaze. By 80 AD, the Roman Empire had reached the height of its power. The emperors of the Flavian line strengthened the Danube defenses, building bridges, walls, and watchtowers. Still, Rome's expansion had its limits. Beyond the river, the Dacians remained defiant, their mountains unconquered, their identity unbroken. The legions could patrol the plains, but the peaks belonged to another world, a world of silence, stone, and gods who did not answer to Rome. In that world, a new name was beginning to gather whispers of awe and expectation. It belonged to a warrior who had served under Duras, who combined the patience of a priest with the cunning of a general. His victories in skirmishes against Roman patrols had already become legend along the frontier. Before long, he would inherit the fractured kingdom and reshape it once more. His name was Decebalus. The age of survival was ending. The age of reckoning was about to begin. The mountains had always produced warriors, but from time to time, they produced something rarer, a mind equal to the land's harshness. After a century of division and drift, That mind appeared in the form of Decebalus. His name meant the brave as 10, yet those who served under him said his strength lay not in courage alone, but in patience. He had learned from a lifetime of watching kings rise and falter, from listening to the priests of Zalmoxis speak of balance and destiny. When his moment came, he moved like a man, answering a call that had echoed for generations. He inherited a fractured realm. Duras, the aging king, ruled what remained of the Dacian heartland from Sarmizegetusa, but his influence no longer reached the Danube. Rival lords along the frontier made their own peace or war with Rome, guided by greed more than loyalty. Decebalus, once a trusted commander under Duras, understood that Dacia could not survive in fragments. He persuaded the old king to abdicate, and when Duras stepped aside, the chieftains, wary yet hopeful, acclaimed Decebalus as ruler. It was not bloodline, but merit that placed the crown upon his brow. From the moment he took power, he faced a world that had grown used to Dacian disunity. Rome had expanded deep into the Balkans, its frontier now running along the Danube. The Emperor Domitian, proud and eager for glory, sought to prove that no barbarian kingdom could stand against Roman steel. Skirmishes that began as border disputes quickly escalated into open war. The first clash came in 85 AD, when Dacian forces struck across the river, raiding Roman forts in Moesia. The attack was sudden, calculated, and devastating. The Romans, stunned by the precision of an enemy they had long dismissed, swore vengeance. Decebalus did not shrink from it. He fortified his southern passes, summoned his generals, and prepared his people for a war unlike any they had known. He was no reckless warlord. His strategy mixed aggression with guile. Where Rome relied on open battle and heavy legions, Decebalus turned to terrain and deception. His fortresses, Kostest, Blidaru, Piatra Roshi, became engines of endurance. Paths through the forests were camouflaged, rivers diverted to confuse scouts, and signal fires linked every ridge from Transylvania to the Danube. The Dacian king had turned his country into a weapon. The first major confrontation came the following year, at Tapai. Cornelius Fuscus, commander of the Roman forces, led a massive army northward through the Iron Gates, confident of an easy victory. Decebalus met him in the narrow defile, where mountains hemmed the road like jaws. The Dacians struck from both slopes at once, arrows, stones, and spears raining upon the legions. In the chaos, Fuscus was surrounded and killed, his eagle standard captured. The victory electrified the mountain kingdom. For the first time in living memory, Dacia had humbled Rome. The triumph carried a message far beyond the battlefield. It was said that Decebalus sacrificed no prisoners, that he burned incense to Zalmoxis and gave thanks to the spirits of the land instead. Rome fought for empire. Dacia fought for meaning. That difference would make the struggle endure for decades. Domitian, enraged, sent new armies north. The next years were a blur of raids and reprisals. The Romans struck deep into Dacia, burning villages and looting sanctuaries, only to find themselves harried and cut off in the forests. Decebalus shifted his tactics with uncanny precision, avoiding decisive battles, drawing his enemies into exhaustion, then striking where least expected. He seemed to know the movements of Roman columns before their commanders did. Later, historians suspected spies among the Roman officers. But the truth was simpler. Decebalus understood how Romans thought. In 88 AD, the tide turned again. The Roman general Tetius Julianus advanced into Dacia with a reorganized force. At the Second Battle of Tapai, the legions broke through the Dacian defenses and forced Decebalus to retreat into the mountains. Yet even in defeat, his retreat was deliberate, a retraction, not a rout. He fortified Sarmizegetusa anew, rebuilt the lines of defense, and sent envoys to parley. Domitian, weary of the endless campaign and facing revolts elsewhere in the empire, accepted negotiation. The treaty that followed in 89 AD was a curious document, part humiliation, part triumph. Rome demanded Dacian submission, yet the terms betrayed who truly held the advantage. Decebalus remained on his throne, recognized by the emperor as a client king. Rome agreed to pay annual subsidies and provide engineers and artisans to rebuild Dacian fortresses. The gesture was meant to ensure loyalty. Instead, it armed Dacia with Roman knowledge. Decebalus accepted the treaty with solemn gratitude, concealing the spark of irony in his eyes. He had won peace without surrender. Under that uneasy peace, Dacia recovered. The king used Roman gold to fortify his realm, turning Sarmizegetusa into a mountain capital of startling sophistication. New walls rose in concentric rings. Aqueducts carried water into cisterns. Workshops hammered bronze and iron into weapons of exceptional quality. Roman engineers, sent to supervise construction, marveled at the precision of Dacian craft. Some remained even after their duties ended, finding in the mountains a quiet order that Rome's cities no longer offered. Decebalus governed with both gentleness and resolve. He rewarded those who served with loyalty, yet punished betrayal without hesitation. Envoys from neighboring tribes, Sarmatians, Bastarnae, and even Scythians, visited his court, offering alliance or tribute. He played them as a chess master plays pieces, ensuring that none could threaten him alone. His brother, Diegis, served as co-commander, loyal and capable. Together they embodied balance, Decebalus the strategist, Diegis the warrior. Despite the outward calm, everyone knew the peace could not last. Rome did not tolerate equals, only subjects. Each year the subsidies flowed northward, and each year the Senate grumbled that the payments fed an enemy rather than pacified a friend. The empire's pride could not bear the thought that beyond its frontier stood a king who had humbled its legions. Decebalus, for his part, prepared for the reckoning he knew would come. He built new fortresses in the western hills, trained cavalry in Scythian tactics, and forged alliances with distant tribes who also feared Roman advance. Yet he did not rush toward war. He ruled for more than a decade, restoring the economy, strengthening the priesthood, and fostering a sense of purpose among his people. To them, he was not merely a monarch, but a restorer, the one who had revived Dacia's pride after generations of decay. Songs of his deeds spread through the valleys, mingling history with prophecy. It was said that when he prayed to Zalmoxis, thunder answered. As the century drew to its end, Rome found new leadership in Emperor Nerva and then in Trajan, a soldier of rare skill and patience. The empire's attention turned once more to the north, to the mountain kingdom that refused to kneel. Decebalus watched the Danube quietly, knowing what was coming. He had bought time, but time was all he had bought. By 96 AD, Dacia stood ready, its walls rebuilt, its armies drilled, its faith unshaken. The mountains waited with their ancient stillness, and the rivers whispered of another reckoning. Decebalus had turned survival into strategy, humiliation into power. Now he would face the empire that claimed dominion over the world. Morning mist rolled through the passes of the Carpathians, softening the stone walls and making the pines shimmer like steel. From the hilltop citadels, the Dacian sentries could see it, the slow, deliberate movement of Roman legions across the plain below. Lines of red standards pierced the haze, and the gleam of armor caught the pale sun. For the first time in generations, Rome had come not to punish, but to conquer. The empire had a new emperor, Trajan, soldier by temperament, strategist by instinct. He had spent years on the Rhine and Danube, studying the art of war, watching how northern tribes moved and fought. Where others saw barbarians, he saw an opponent worthy of the legions. When he became emperor, the question of Dacia was not merely political, it was personal. The subsidies that once bought peace had become an embarrassment. To restore Rome's honor, Trajan would destroy the mountain kingdom that had humiliated it. Across the river, Decebalus waited. He knew the patterns of empire, how it pressed forward with certainty, how it demanded obedience and masked ambition with ceremony. He had prepared for this moment not with speeches, but with stone. His fortresses had been rebuilt and linked by hidden roads. His people had been trained not only to fight, but to endure. In the forests, traps were laid where the Romans least expected them. Streams were diverted, bridges rigged to collapse. Dacia was not a land. It was a labyrinth. When the legions crossed the Danube, they did so on a marvel of Roman engineering. A bridge designed by Apollodorus of Damascus, its wooden arches resting on great stone piers. It was both a road and a declaration. Rome had bridged the frontier between order and wilderness, between empire and freedom. Each step of the soldiers across it was a drumbeat of inevitability. Trajan advanced north with precision. His columns stretched for miles, shadowed by cavalry and engineers. Along the way, forts rose behind them, temporary at first, then permanent. The land was marked, claimed, and measured. Yet the deeper the legions moved into the mountains, the less their discipline availed them. Narrow paths broke their formations. Fog and sudden rain turned the roads to rivers of mud. The Dacians struck like ghosts, appearing from the trees, hurling javelins and stones before vanishing into the mist. At Tapai, the two armies finally met in full. The field was narrow, hemmed in by slopes, a place that seemed built for ambush. Decebalus used it to perfection. His warriors descended from the ridges in waves, their curved blades flashing in the morning light. They fought not for land or plunder, but for the idea of Dacia itself. The Romans pressed hard, reeled, and rallied. Trajan rode among them, calm and relentless, his presence turning chaos into resolve. When the Dacian false found its mark, cutting through shields and helmets, the emperor ordered new armor forged on the spot, reinforced helmets, stronger greaves. Rome adapted as it bled. The battle dragged on for days. At dusk, the mountains glowed with the fires of both camps, their light flickering on the mist as if the sky itself burned. The Dacians withdrew into the forests when night fell, their casualties heavy but their spirit intact. For the Romans, it was not yet victory, but survival. The war had only begun. Trajan pressed onward, capturing one fortress after another. Kostest fell, then Blidaru. The walls that had defied the southern world for centuries cracked beneath the siege engines and disciplined assault of the legions. Yet the Dacians fought with uncanny unity, farmers joining soldiers, women carrying water to the walls, elders praying to Zalmoxis in the temples above the battle. When a fortress fell, another lit its fires in defiance. Among Trajan's commanders was Lucius Quietus, a Moorish cavalryman whose skill in irregular warfare mirrored Decebalus's own. His riders struck deep into the forests, pursuing Dacian raiders through ravines where even Roman scouts feared to tread. Slowly, painfully, the empire learned the geography of resistance. Each victory carried its cost. Roads vanished into fog. Supply lines were cut. The legions fought hunger and exhaustion as fiercely as they fought men. Decebalus knew how to make the land itself an ally. He flooded valleys, poisoned wells, and sent decoys to mislead enemy scouts. For every Roman camp that rose, a Dacian ambush waited in the shadows. Yet he could not hold forever. The machine that was Rome, its discipline, its endless reinforcements, ground forward without rest. As the year turned, Trajan changed his strategy. He no longer sought a single decisive battle, but a tightening of the net. Fortresses that could not be stormed were starved. Tribes that hesitated were bribed or broken. Each surrender chipped away at Decebalus's alliances until only the heartland remained, Sarmizegetusa, the mountain capital. When Trajan's army approached the citadel, it did not attack at once. He encircled it, cutting off water and supply routes. Siege engines were built on terraces carved from the slopes. The sound of hammering carried through the forest for days, a rhythm of conquest echoing the rhythm of prayer. The Dacians held out longer than anyone expected, their resolve fed by faith. Inside the city, priests sang to Zalmoxis, and warriors sharpened their blades by firelight, knowing that defeat here meant more than death. At last, Decebalus sent envoys. He offered peace in exchange for recognition, pledging that his kingdom would trouble Rome no more. Trajan, weary of blood but unwilling to overextend, accepted. The terms were harsh, yet measured. Dacia would remain under its king, but its fortresses would be dismantled, its war machines surrendered, its borders watched by Roman garrisons. In return, Rome offered safety and dignity. When the treaty was signed, the legions withdrew, leaving behind ashes and silence. To Rome, it was victory, a campaign that restored pride and avenged humiliation. To Dacia, it was endurance. Decebalus had not been conquered, only cornered. He turned at once to rebuilding, using Roman subsidies and captured knowledge to strengthen what remained. In the years that followed, the mountains were quieter, but the quiet was deceptive. Dacia's capital grew more sophisticated than ever. New temples rose on the terraces. Workshops produced weapons with Roman precision and Dacian ingenuity. The aqueducts rebuilt by Roman engineers now served to supply hidden reservoirs. Even peace was turned into preparation. For Trajan, the campaign became legend. Poets celebrated his triumph. Sculptors began to imagine the scenes that would one day spiral around a marble column in Rome. Yet the emperor knew what those artists could not. The war had ended, but the Dacians had not yielded. The fires on the mountain ridges still burned at night, signaling to the gods and to their king that the struggle was not finished. Rome, victorious, turned homeward. Dacia, wounded but unbroken, waited. Both sides understood that treaties are pauses, not endings. And so, between the two greatest wills of their age, the Empire of the South and the Kingdom of the Mountains, there stretched a silence heavy with promise. The next war had already begun in the hearts of men who could not share the same sky. Smoke from distant hearths hung over the valleys like a veil of warning. For years, a fragile peace had rested on words neither side believed. Roman merchants came north with amphorae and silk. Dacian traders carried iron and honey south. Yet every exchange smelled faintly of preparation. Beneath the calm, both rulers counted their spears. In the mountain capital, Decebalus walked the terraces of Sarmizegetusa. listening to the water that fed the city's sacred springs. Roman engineers had helped build these channels after the last war. Now he ordered them mapped in secret. Peace, he told his council, was only the interval between sieges. His artisans reforged the old weapons. His scouts rode the frontiers. His priests spoke of destiny unfulfilled. Far to the south, Trajan studied those same ridges from the banks of the Danube. Reports from his envoys spoke of fortresses rebuilt under the guise of repair, and of Roman deserters sheltered in the Dacian hills. He could forgive deception less than defeat. What Rome called rebellion, he called necessity. What Decebalus called preparation, he named treason. Both men understood that their next meeting would decide whose order the world would follow. When the emperor finally gave the signal, the Danube bridge of Apollodorus shuddered beneath the weight of empire. Legion after legion crossed its arches, Spaniards with their short swords, Syrians with bows, engineers dragging siege towers behind teams of oxen. Drums marked the pace. Priests scattered salt before the columns. The river that had divided civilization from wilderness became a road of conquest. In Dacia's foothills, alarm horns echoed from peak to peak. Villagers fled into forests, driving their herds before them. Messengers rode through night fog toward the royal citadel. Decebalus answered with calm precision. The passes were to be trapped, the rivers dammed, the paths erased. "We will not meet Rome on her own ground," he told his captains. "She must lose herself in ours." Rain accompanied the invasion. Mud clogged the Roman wheels, and fog swallowed the banners. From behind curtains of pine, Dacian archers released volleys that seemed to come from the forest itself. A convoy vanished in a ravine, its escort cut down before they could form ranks. Every step forward required a road. Every road required an army to guard it. Rome advanced, but the advance felt like drowning. Trajan answered with patience. Rather than chase phantoms, he built permanence. Each camp became a fort, each fort a signal of possession. The landscape slowly changed shape under Roman geometry. Straight lines cutting across valleys that had known only curves. Civilization, in its cold discipline, began to overwrite wilderness. By midsummer, the emperor had reached the heart of the highlands. Decebalus withdrew into his fortresses, trading land for time. In the chaos of one skirmish, the Romans captured Decebalus, a confidant whose knowledge proved fatal. Promised his life, he revealed the secret network of aqueducts that fed the Dacian capital. What he betrayed was not just a defense, but a lifeline. Once Trajan's engineers diverted those channels, the siege turned from struggle to starvation. Springs dried, and the sacred fountains in the temple courtyards fell silent. Without water, the city could not stand. Yet surrender never came. Men carried skins of rainwater up the slopes. Women fought beside them on the walls. Priests sang to Zalmoxis, their voices hoarse from smoke. Every night, flames painted the clouds red above the mountains, and still the horns of defiance sounded from the citadel. Inside those walls, Decebalus moved among his people quietly, bandaging wounds, sharing food, promising nothing except that they would meet their ancestors unashamed. Armor had lost its meaning. His strength was in composure. When the final assault breached the outer defenses, he ordered the temples burned so that no Roman hand could desecrate them. At dawn, the last gate fell. Roman standards climbed the terraces as if ascending an altar. Behind them came fire, controlled, methodical, merciless. Sarmizegetusa, the sacred heart of the mountains, became a furnace. Amid the chaos, Decebalus slipped away with a handful of riders. They carried neither treasure nor prisoners. only the remnants of their nation's pride. For days the pursuit continued through forests thick with mist. The emperor wanted the Dacian king alive. Triumph demanded a captive. Scouts followed hoofprints that vanished in rivers, trails that ended in thin air. At last, on a hillside above the Sargetia, they caught sight of him. Surrounded, he drew his dagger, murmured a prayer to the god who promised immortality, and ended his life before any soldier could claim the glory. The Romans halted in awe. Even in defeat, he commanded respect. Soon afterward, the empire claimed not only his body, but his legend. A captured servant revealed the hiding place of the royal treasure, gold and silver buried beneath the river's bed, concealed by dams and reeds. Roman divers drained the water, lifting glitter from the mud as if plundering the veins of the earth itself. Those riches would fund monuments that still gleam in marble, forums, arches, and the column that spirals through eternity with the story of Dacia carved upon its skin. In the provinces, celebration erupted. Trajan's triumph filled the streets of Rome with prisoners in chains and heaps of captured arms. Yet beneath the cheers lay exhaustion. The campaign had consumed legions, drained coffers, and tested the emperor's faith in his own destiny. He had gained a province, but lost the simplicity of conquest. Dacia had been more than an enemy. It had been a mirror showing Rome its own hunger. South of the mountains, engineers set about reshaping victory into permanence. Surveyors laid out cities on the Roman model, grids of straight streets and tiled roofs gleaming in the northern light. Colonia Ulpia Traiana rose where the Dacian capital had burned. Veterans from Italy settled its outskirts. Miners from Hispania opened the gold veins of Transylvania, and traders built markets where temples once stood. Latin words began to mingle with mountain speech, until even the echoes in the valleys sounded half Roman. Not everyone stayed to watch the transformation. Many Dacians slipped into the wilderness, joining the scattered tribes beyond the empire's new borders. They called themselves the Free Dacians, guardians of memory and faith. From the high forests, they raided the Roman mines and vanished again into legend. Rome called them brigands. Their own songs named them avengers. Years later, visitors to the imperial forum would tilt their heads upward toward Trajan's column. Winding around its white shaft, carved legions crossed bridges, stormed walls, raised eagles above burning towns. At the top, the emperor stood serene, gazing east as if eternity itself awaited his command. Few noticed, far below, the carved figure of a Dacian king taking his own life rather than kneel. Marble remembers everything, even what it was built to forget. And so, the mountains remained, quiet, watching, older than empire. The roads of Rome traced their slopes for a time. The cities glittered for a century, but the silence endured. In that silence lingered the whisper of Decebalus, that no wall, no monument, no victory is final. Empires pass. The land endures. In the years that followed the conquest, the mountains wore a new name. Dacia, once the realm of kings and priests, became a province of Rome. The eagle banners rose where the wolf-headed standards had fallen, and Latin replaced the old songs of the hills. Yet beneath the order imposed by empire, the land retained its pulse, a slow rhythm of endurance that no decree could erase. Across the valleys, construction began with the confidence of victory. Surveyors marked out grids where fortresses had once stood. Sarmizegetusa was rebuilt not as a sanctuary, but as a colony, Colonia Ulpia Traiana, Augusta Dacica, a city designed to be Rome in miniature. Marble forums gleamed under the cold northern sun. Statues of the emperor stood on plinths where the altars of Zalmoxis had burned. Roads radiated outward like veins, linking the mining towns and garrisons that kept the new frontier alive. Legionaries became settlers. The 13th Gemina, veterans from the Rhine, took position at Apulum, while 5th Macedonica was stationed at Potesa. Around each camp grew civilian quarters, taverns, workshops, bathhouses. Traders arrived from the Balkans and the eastern provinces, bringing amphorae of wine, lamps from Antioch, and gossip from the Mediterranean. Within a generation, Dacia began to look and sound Roman. Latin words blended with local speech, new gods mingled with old, and the scent of olive oil replaced the smoke of sacrificial fires. Still, the transformation was not complete. Beyond the city walls, the hills remained Dacian. Peasants in the uplands still buried their dead with bracelets shaped like serpents, still whispered prayers to mountain spirits before crossing rivers. In the evenings, the shepherds sang of Decebalus and the wars that had tested the courage of their ancestors. To Rome, these people were provincials. To themselves, they were the children of a kingdom that refused to die. Gold drove the empire's persistence here. From the mines of Alburnus, Mayer, and Ampelum poured the wealth that filled Trajan's coffers. Tunnels were dug deep into the mountains, and the clang of hammers echoed day and night. Slaves and freedmen worked shoulder to shoulder, their sweat funding the marble splendor of Rome. Tablets of wax and bronze record their lives, contracts, debts, disputes, and fleeting hopes. Their Latin is rough, their spelling uneven, yet each line testifies that Roman civilization had seeped into the very stone. Over time, prosperity bred complacency. Under Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, the frontier quieted, the legions relaxed. New towns rose, Napoca, Porolissum, Diurna, connected by the great military road that traced the Muresh Valley. Villas spread across the plains, mosaics bright with color. Wealthy settlers hosted feasts beneath frescoes of Bacchus and Venus, never doubting that Rome's order would last forever. But the peace was never absolute. North and east of the province lived the free Dacians, Carpi and Costoboci, tribes that remembered too well the price of subjugation. They watched the Roman roads with patient hatred, striking whenever the garrisons thinned. In the reign of Antoninus Pius, the hills flared with revolt. Bands of warriors swept through mining districts, burning workshops and slaughtering tax collectors. Roman reinforcements restored control, yet the rebellion left a scar. To the south, the empire's frontiers shuddered under new pressures. Germanic tribes pressed westward, and nomads roamed the steppes beyond the Black Sea. Dacia stood exposed, a lonely finger of empire north of the Danube, costly to defend and impossible to abandon. Successive emperors fortified it again and again, each adding walls and watchtowers as if stone alone could resist history. Life within those defenses continued with Roman dignity. Bathhouses steamed through winter, amphitheaters filled with laughter and blood. Local nobles gained Roman citizenship, their sons serving as officers in distant legions. Inscriptions from Apulum praise governors, merchants, and priests who dedicated temples to Jupiter and Minerva. Latin became the language of ambition, the key to advancement. Even those who still honored their old gods learned to carve their dedications in Roman letters. Yet in the countryside, another world endured. Farmers left small offerings at crossroads, garlands of grain, coins, clay figurines of wolves and eagles entwined. These were the symbols of survival, a quiet acknowledgement that Rome might rule the cities. But the spirits of the land still ruled the fields. Archaeologists would one day find their traces. rustic shrines beside Roman villas, sanctuaries where Zalmoxis and Jupiter shared the same altar. During the Marcomannic Wars, under Marcus Aurelius, the illusion of safety shattered. Waves of tribes from beyond the Danube poured into the province, burning and plundering. The legions fought fiercely, but the invaders left behind famine and disease. Refugees crowded into the fortified cities, and for the first time since Trajan's triumph, Dacia felt the edge of fear. The emperor restored order, yet the memory of vulnerability lingered. Rome had extended too far, and the mountains whispered what the Senate dared not say. Nothing built on conquest lasts forever. Even so, life returned to its rhythm. Markets reopened, temples were rededicated, and children born after the war knew only the empire's peace. Coins from this era bear the serene faces of emperors long dead, circulating among people who had never seen Italy, but called themselves Romans nonetheless. A farmer tilling the soil near Apulum might never have heard of Trajan, yet the language he spoke was his legacy. By the 3rd century, cracks deepened in the imperial facade. Civil wars raged in the west. In the east, new enemies rose. Dacia's prosperity made it both prize and burden. The gold that once enriched Rome now attracted raiders from every horizon. The legions held as long as they could, but exhaustion replaced glory. Garrisons shrank, roads fell into disrepair, and the border towns became fortresses once more. As decline spread, the mixture of cultures within the province created something lasting. Romans married Dacians, veterans settled among locals, children bore names that blended both heritages. Their gods merged, their festivals intertwined. On winter nights, the same families might offer prayers to Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, and to the mountain ancestor whose name no longer had a Roman equivalent. Out of conquest had come fusion, a fragile, enduring synthesis. In its final decades, Dacia existed like a candle flickering in wind. Emperors changed faster than seasons. Each sent edicts promising protection, few kept them. The once proud province had become a frontier, constantly on the brink of abandonment. Yet its people endured, resilient as the stone that shaped their homes. When historians later spoke of Dacia, they remembered mines, cities, and fortresses, but the true legacy was linguistic and spiritual. Rome had conquered the land, but the land had altered Rome in return. In the mingling of speech and custom, a new voice was forming, the ancestor of a culture that would outlive both conqueror and conquered. For now, though, the eagle still flew above Apulum, and legionaries still patrolled the ridges. The empire, vast and weary, held the mountains in its grasp. From the terraces of Colonia Traiana, one could see the forests stretching northward, dark and endless. Beyond them lay freedom, and the tribes already gathering in the shadows, while Roman banners glittered in the valleys, and new colonies spread across the plains. Another Dacia lived beyond the empire's reach. In the highlands and northern forests, across rivers where no legion dared patrol, the unconquered tribes endured. The Romans called them Daci Liberi, the free Dacians. To themselves, they were simply the ones who had never bowed. Their homeland lay beyond the Danube and the Olt, a landscape of ridges, deep woods, and iron-grey rivers. It was a harsher country than the Roman province to the south, but it offered the only freedom left. Here, the descendants of warriors who had fought under Decebalus kept their faith, their language, and their pride. They built no cities, raised no marble, and needed no emperors. Their citadels were cliffs, their temples the caves where priests of Zalmoxis still whispered prayers by torchlight. The empire marked their lands on its maps as empty space, but they were far from empty. Tribes such as the Carpi and the Costoboci ruled there, moving with the seasons, herding in summer and raiding in winter. To the Romans, they were nuisances, wild men who stole cattle and burned border forts. Yet these same barbarians preserved the pulse of an older Dacia. Their war cries carried the same rhythm once heard at Tapai. Their rituals still invoked the mountain god who had promised immortality. At night, the fires of their camps could be seen from the Roman side of the frontier, flickering like defiance made visible. Between those flames and the lamplight of the garrisons lay more than a river. It was the divide between two visions of order. South of the Danube, Rome measured time in calendars and edicts. North of it, the free Dacians marked their years by battles and omens. Each side believed itself the true heir of the land. Conflict was constant, though rarely open war. The free Dacians raided the province for iron and captives. The legions retaliated with campaigns meant to punish and intimidate. Neither could destroy the other. The Romans had discipline and numbers. The tribes had mobility and the terrain. Each mountain pass, each forest glade, was a battlefield already prepared by nature. Rome could occupy the plains, but the mountains belonged to the wind and those who followed it. The Carpi were the fiercest among them. Living along the eastern slopes of the Carpathians, they became both raiders and traders. They crossed the frontier when the Danube froze, seizing Roman goods, then returned in summer to sell what they had stolen. Sometimes they served as mercenaries for Roman governors, fighting Rome's other enemies in exchange for gold and weapons. But loyalty was seasonal and memory long. When opportunities came, they turned their blades again toward the empire. The Costoboci, settled further west, carved their own legend. In one audacious campaign, they swept south through Moesia and Macedonia, reaching as far as Greece. Chronicles from Athens describe wild horsemen appearing at dawn, shouting in strange tongues and carrying the thunder of the north. They plundered temples and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. The Greeks called it barbarism. The Dacians would have called it revenge. Beyond the raids and wars, there was endurance. Among the high ridges, communities continued the way of life their ancestors had known before Rome. Villages clung to steep valleys where the legions could not march. Their houses were built of timber and thatch, their walls carved with spirals and solar signs, the same symbols found centuries earlier on Dacian altars. Archaeologists would later uncover pottery and ornaments nearly identical to those from the age of Decebalus, as though time itself had chosen to linger there. Religion bound them more tightly than blood. The cult of Zalmoxis survived intact in the mountains, reshaped but never erased. His priests, called by the Romans Kapnobatai, those who walk in smoke, held ceremonies in caves thick with incense. They taught that death was only passage, that the soul's immortality was the true victory denied by empire. In the valleys of Roman Dacia, men prayed in Latin to Jupiter. In the highlands, they still invoked the god who had promised freedom beyond fear. Two civilizations shared a sky, but not a heaven. Over time, contact between the two worlds grew strangely symbiotic. Roman traders ventured north under guard, exchanging salt, wine, and glass for amber, furs, and slaves. Some free Dacians served in Roman auxiliary units, earning pay and citizenship before returning to their hills. Through these exchanges, ideas crossed invisibly. Latin words crept into Dacian speech. Roman tools appeared in tribal forges, and Dacian ironwork found its way into Roman markets. Resistance and exchange became two sides of the same survival. In the 3rd century, the balance began to tilt. new powers arrived from the steppes, Sarmatians, then Goths, pressing against the Dacian lands. The free Dacians fought them as fiercely as they had fought Rome, but their numbers dwindled. The empire, weakened by civil war, could no longer police its borders effectively. The Carpi took advantage, launching massive incursions into Roman territory. At their height, they raided as far as Pannonia, forcing the emperors of the crisis years to buy peace with tribute. For a brief moment, the mountain tribes seemed to have turned the tables on their ancient conqueror. But fortune turned as quickly as it had risen. Emperor Aurelian, preparing to withdraw from the province altogether, struck one last punitive campaign against them. He drove the Carpi north and east, deporting many into Roman territory to repopulate deserted lands. Others were scattered across the plains by Gothic pressure. The proud name of the free Dacians began to fade from record, replaced by the swelling chorus of new invaders who now filled the Carpathian basin. Even as their political identity dissolved, their spirit left its mark. The mountain sanctuaries remained active long after Roman Dacia was gone. Coins from every emperor, Hadrian, Antoninus, Marcus Aurelius, have been found beside crude idols carved from wood, suggesting that Dacian traders still moved between worlds, bridging the sacred and the profane. Their language, infused with Latin borrowings, survived in borderlands where the empire's reach had thinned. It was there, in those margins, that a future tongue began to take shape, a fusion of conqueror and conquered, destined to outlive them both. From a Roman perspective, the free Dacians were an irritant, a recurring rebellion. From a wider view, they were the keepers of continuity. While empires rose and fell, they kept the mountains inhabited, the passes watched, the fires burning. When the legions finally departed and the frontier crumbled, it was these hill peoples, half Roman in speech, half Dacian in soul, who remained to inherit the silence. By the time Rome formally abandoned Dacia, the distinction between free and subject had blurred beyond meaning. The descendants of the free Dacians mingled with the settlers who stayed behind, creating the lineage that would populate the mountains for centuries. Their world had never known peace, but it had known survival, and in that survival lay a victory that neither Rome's legions nor the passing tribes could erase. They had outlasted conquest not by defeating it, but by absorbing it. Their resistance was not rebellion, but endurance, a quiet refusal to vanish. In the high valleys, where the forests still held the shapes of ancient walls, their descendants watched the empire withdraw and whispered the same prayer their ancestors had spoken before any Roman crossed the Danube, that the land would endure, that the mountains would remember, that Dacia, though conquered, would never die. The mountains had seen kingdoms rise and empires fade, yet even they seemed to grieve when the Romans began to withdraw. For more than a century and a half, their banners had crowned the ridges and valleys. Their laws had ordered the rhythm of the land. Now that rhythm faltered. The empire, beset by crises on every border, could no longer defend a province that had become both a prize and a liability. The decision to leave was less an act of policy than a surrender to exhaustion. Long before the final command, the signs had been clear. The 3rd century was an age of unraveling. Emperors crowned and murdered in the same year, invasions pouring across the Rhine, plague and famine sweeping through the provinces. Dacia, far to the north and isolated beyond the Danube, felt the empire's tremors like aftershocks of a distant earthquake. Garrisons shrank, roads crumbled, the legions stretched thinner with each campaign. Raiders came not in waves, but in tides. Goths, Carpi, Vandals, names that carried the chill of the steppe. Inside the cities, the sense of security that Rome had once promised began to erode. At Colonia, Ulpia Traiana, merchants shuttered their shops earlier each night. Temples stood half empty, as priests whispered of omens. The great mines of Alburnus Mea fell silent, their tunnels flooded and abandoned. In Apulum, the soldiers of the 13th Gemina patrolled streets more out of habit than hope. They could no longer protect the countryside, only themselves. When Aurelian came to power, the empire was already bleeding at its edges. He was a soldier emperor, pragmatic and stern, and he saw what others had refused to see. Dacia could not be held. It lay north of the Danube, separated from the empire's heart by a river that could no longer be safely crossed in winter. The legions were exhausted, the supply lines too long, the enemies too many. To save the empire, he would have to sacrifice its outermost skin. The decision, when it came, was swift, but not without sorrow. Edicts were issued for the evacuation of civilians willing to resettle south of the river. Veterans, colonists, merchants, and their families gathered what they could carry. Caravans wound through the mountain passes toward the Danube crossings, an exodus more mournful than triumphant. Those who had once come north as conquerors now went south as refugees. Some looked back from the riverbanks, watching the peaks fade behind mist, whispering prayers in Latin and Dacian alike. Aurelian established a new province on the safer side of the river, Dacia Aureliana, so that the name, at least, would survive. Its capital at Serdica and later Ratiaria became home to the displaced. There, the exiled communities rebuilt fragments of their old life. Markets named after lost towns, sanctuaries dedicated to gods who had shared their defeat. Yet no walls or statues could disguise the truth. What they had abandoned was more than territory. It was memory carved into stone, a century and a half of belonging. North of the river, silence returned. The Roman fortresses stood empty, their gates torn down for timber, their temples open to the sky. Fields once sown by veterans reverted to wilderness. Wolves roamed through forums where magistrates had once passed judgment. In some cities, small groups of locals remained. Farmers too poor to flee, priests too faithful to leave their gods. They tended their shrines and buried their dead beneath the old Latin inscriptions, hoping the empire might return. But new peoples were already arriving. The Goths descended from the steppes, their wagons rumbling across the plains like distant thunder. The Carpi pressed in from the east, carving settlements among the ruins. To them, the Roman cities were treasure houses and tombs both. Marble for their altars, iron for their weapons, gold hidden in forgotten cellars. The land did not die. It changed its masters. In the south, the displaced Dacians and Romans adapted as best they could. Many enlisted in the legions or served as farmers on imperial estates. Their children grew up speaking a Latin flavored with the mountain tongue, their faith a mixture of old and new. The cult of Zalmoxis, long suppressed, re-emerged quietly, merged now with Roman notions of the afterlife. Even exile could not erase the habit of belief. Among the imperial elite, Dacia's loss was spoken of with regret but little surprise. Senators debated its strategic value. Generals cursed its distance. Scholars wrote elegies for its civilization. Yet few truly understood what had been left behind. The province had not been merely an outpost. It had been a laboratory of empire, a place where Roman order and local resilience had fused into something distinct. Its departure left a wound that geography alone could not heal. Meanwhile, life on the abandoned frontier continued in strange half-Roman rhythms. Traders from the south still ventured northward in summer, bartering wine and salt for furs and slaves. Some garrisons lingered on the southern bank, watching the opposite shore where overgrown watchtowers still gleamed in sunlight. At dusk, the Danube carried back echoes, a shepherd's flute, a dog's bark, perhaps the murmur of a Latin prayer drifting from a forgotten chapel. For the empire, the withdrawal marked both an end and a revelation. Rome had reached its natural limits. The dream of endless conquest, which had begun with Augustus and found its apex under Trajan, ended here among the Carpathians. The northern frontier became a scar, reminding every emperor after Aurelian that even eagles must retreat. Dacia, once Rome's proudest conquest, became its most poignant loss. Yet even abandonment can birth endurance. The people who had lived in the province did not vanish. They adapted. Over generations, Latin-speaking communities persisted in the valleys south and north of the river, blending with those who had remained behind. Out of this mingling would arise the faint beginnings of a new identity. Neither fully Roman nor fully Dacian, but something enduring that would echo through the centuries to come. The ruins themselves told the story best. At Apulum, weeds grew through the cracks of the amphitheatre, where laughter and blood had once mingled. In Sarmizegetusa, the Roman temples crumbled beside the Dacian altars they had replaced, as if the gods of both nations had agreed on a truce. Every spring, the rivers burst their banks and washed over the remnants of roads and walls, carrying fragments of marble downstream. Travelers, who later found them in the mud, called them stones of memory. Far away in Rome, emperors continued to rule, but their maps no longer included the province that had once symbolized imperial pride. The Danube frontier hardened into a boundary not just of geography, but of imagination. To the south lay the world of law and order. To the north, the realm of mystery, mountains, and ghosts. The Romans called it Barbaricum, yet for those who still remembered, it remained home. And perhaps, in the evenings, when the wind swept down from the Carpathians, even the soldiers on the southern bank felt its pull. The sound of rivers that once ran beneath Roman bridges, the echo of chants from lost temples. They would look north and see nothing but darkness, yet know that in that darkness lingered the echo of a people who refused to be erased. The empire had withdrawn, but Dacia was not gone. It had merely changed form, retreating into the mountains, into language, into memory. Stone had fallen, but spirit had endured. Wind swept through the abandoned fortresses, where once Roman eagles had glinted in the sun. Moss climbed the walls, trees rooted in the cracks, and the silence that returned to the mountains was not peace, but vigilance. For centuries, armies had marched through these valleys. Now only echoes remained. Yet beneath the stillness, life endured. The Dacians had not vanished when Rome withdrew. They had scattered, blended, and adapted, their presence woven into the shifting tribes that flowed across the Carpathian world. The land they left behind became a crossroads once more. From the east came the Goths, tall and relentless, driving their wagons across the plains and claiming the Roman ruins as their own. To them, the remnants of Dacian and Roman walls were convenient shelters, temples reimagined as halls, amphitheatres turned into marketplaces. The fusion that had begun under Rome continued under these new masters, though now it spoke with a different accent and prayed to different gods. Some of the old inhabitants submitted quietly, trading labor for protection. Others fled into the high valleys where the ancient tongue still survived. There, among forests untouched by empire, families kept the rhythms of an older life. They tilled narrow fields, kept herds on the upland meadows, and passed down songs that spoke of mountain kings and the god who promised immortality. Though they no longer called themselves Dacians, the memory lingered in the stories told by firelight. Farther south, the empire lived on in another form. Constantinople had risen from the bones of old Byzantium, and the eastern emperors claimed to be heirs of Rome entire. From their marble halls, they watched the northern frontier, with equal parts fear and longing. To them, the lands beyond the Danube were both threat and inheritance, lost provinces that haunted imperial dreams. Byzantine chroniclers still used the name Dacia, though few who read their words could imagine what the place had once been. In the 4th century, waves of new peoples poured through the Carpathians. The Visigoths came first, fleeing the pressure of the Huns. For a generation, they dominated the region, blending with remnants of Roman culture. Archaeologists would later find traces of this uneasy coexistence. Fibulae, shaped in Roman style, but forged with Gothic hands. Pottery stamped with both Latin letters and runic marks. In those hybrid forms lay the truth of the age, a world dissolving and recombining faster than anyone could record it. When the Huns arrived, they came like a storm. Their horsemen swept through the plains, their bows raining fire on every settlement that dared resist. Cities that had endured since Trajan's conquest burned to ashes. The Gothic kings fled westward, leaving behind shattered tribes and scattered survivors. In the mountains, the hidden villages endured as they always had. The Huns did not linger among the peaks. They sought the wealth of cities, not the endurance of shepherds. Under Attila, the Carpathian Basin became the heart of a short-lived empire of motion and terror. Envoys from Constantinople crossed these lands carrying gold and trembling prayers for peace. Somewhere in that vast, transient dominion lived the descendants of those who had once called themselves Dacians, now indistinguishable from their Gothic, Sarmatian, or Romanized neighbors. They had become the quiet background of history, the soil from which new peoples grew. After Attila's death, the world convulsed again. The Huns vanished as swiftly as they had appeared, leaving emptiness in their wake. Into that void came the Gepids, another Germanic tribe, who settled along the Tisza and claimed the ruins of Apulum and Porolissum as their capitals. They repaired the Roman roads, minted coins, and buried their nobles with swords inlaid with garnets. Their rule was gentler than the Huns, yet they too saw themselves as inheritors, not creators. The mountains remained untamed, the valleys restless. In Constantinople, emperors watched and plotted. They sent missionaries north, men fluent in both Latin and faith, bearing crosses instead of swords. Christianity had long touched the region's edges, but now it crept inland, carried by exiles, traders, and soldiers. In the ruins of Roman temples, the cross replaced the eagle. Yet even conversion came in fragments. The Highlanders baptized their children in rivers sacred long before Christ. They built chapels near the shrines of older gods. Their faith was a negotiation between heaven and the earth they knew too well. Through these centuries of shifting dominion, the name of Dacia faded from official maps, but persisted in memory. Byzantine scribes referred to Dacia Ripensis and Dacia Mediterranea, new provinces south of the Danube named to keep the ghost alive. The real land north of the river belonged to no empire. Travelers described it as a wilderness inhabited by shepherds and warriors, a place where Roman ruins rose from forests like the bones of giants. Life continued in patterns that ignored conquest. Spring saw the migration of flocks to mountain pastures. Autumn brought harvest festivals that mingled Roman customs with older rites. The people drank from clay cups patterned after designs their ancestors had carved centuries earlier. Women still wore bracelets shaped like serpents, their spirals echoing a faith older than memory. Every gesture was inheritance disguised as habit. When the Lombards came in the 6th century, they found a landscape already layered with civilizations. Their historians wrote of small communities speaking a corrupted Latin and claiming descent from Romans left behind. Perhaps these were the descendants of miners, soldiers, and settlers who had refused to leave when Aurelian withdrew. Perhaps they were simply the new name of the Dacians, transformed yet continuous. The empire they had served was gone, but their language, worn, reshaped, and tenacious, survived like a thread through the centuries. Meanwhile, the Byzantines reasserted their influence over the lower Danube. Their armies built forts on the southern bank, their bishops sent letters across the river. Yet what they saw in their northern neighbours was not merely barbarism. Reports from the frontier spoke of communities who still used Roman weights and measures, who carved crosses beside pagan symbols, who buried their dead facing east as Romans once did. Civilization, it seemed, had retreated, but not died. To live in the Carpathian world during these centuries was to exist in a state of perpetual transition. One empire followed another, and yet the mountains remained indifferent. They had sheltered the Dacians from Persians, Celts, Macedonians, Romans, Goths, and Huns. They would shelter others still. The people who dwelled within them adapted as easily as the forests changed with the seasons. Continuity here was not political, it was geological. In later chronicles, written from monasteries, monks would describe these lands as haunted, a wilderness peopled by shadows of nations. They were not wrong. The shadows belonged to every people who had ever passed through, and to those who had never left. When the Avars arrived, then the Slavs, the land absorbed them as it had absorbed Rome and all before it. The Carpathians did not destroy civilizations, they digested them. By the end of the 6th century, new voices filled the valleys, Slavic tongues mingling with remnants of Latin and Gothic. The Byzantine Empire, stretched thin, still claimed the Danube frontier, but no longer believed in it. Beyond that river, a mosaic of tribes, faiths, and memories coexisted. Among them lived those who remembered faintly that they had once been something called Dacian. They had no need to proclaim it. The land spoke for them. At twilight, when the wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, the hills themselves seemed to murmur fragments of their story, half Latin, half lost. Travellers crossing the ridges would hear songs that no empire had composed, in a language that was neither Roman nor barbarian, but something in between. It was the voice of survival, patient and quiet, echoing from the stone foundations of vanished cities. Civilizations had come and gone, but the Carpathians kept their faith with endurance. Beneath the ruins and migrations, a cultural continuity persisted, unwritten, unnamed, but unbroken. The world called these centuries dark. To those who lived them, they were simply the long night between empires. And in that night, the soul of Dacia slept lightly, waiting for dawn. Morning returned to the Carpathians as if nothing had changed. Mist drifted through the valleys where empires had fallen, wrapping the ruins in silence. The marble of Roman cities had weathered into pale bones, their inscriptions fading under moss. Yet beneath that stillness, something ancient endured. The Dacians, no longer visible as a nation, no longer named in chronicles, had become the invisible root of the land itself. In the 6th century, the old world was dissolving into new forms. the Slavs poured across the Danube, settling the plains and river valleys with their wooden villages and pagan altars. To the west, the Lombards pushed into Italy. To the east, Byzantium clung to its fragile authority. Amid this restless migration, the Carpathian Basin remained a mosaic of tongues and tribes. Slavs, Avars, remnants of Goths and Gepids, and among them, the quiet descendants of Rome's northern province. They no longer called themselves Dacians, but the shape of their lives, how they built, spoke, and prayed, carried echoes of that older identity. In the mountains and deep valleys, Latin never died. It changed, softened by isolation, bent by foreign tongues, but it endured. Herdsmen trading salt and cheese still used Latin numerals. Priests baptizing infants spoke Latin prayers. Travelers recited blessings that mixed the names of Christ and Zalmoxis in the same breath. To outsiders, these communities seemed half legendary, mountain folk who spoke a language no one else could quite understand. Yet that language, surviving through centuries of silence, was the most enduring monument the Dacians ever built. The Byzantine writers, who glimpsed them from afar, sensed the persistence without fully grasping it. Procopius and Theophylact Simocata wrote of northern peoples who claimed Roman descent, who kept crosses carved in the style of old provincial art, who sang in a corrupted Latin. The empire called them Romans of the North, imagining them as exiles of its own faith. In truth, they were something older, children of both the conquerors and the conquered, heirs to the mingled blood of legionaries and Dacian warriors, miners and priests, colonists and mountain shepherds. Through the valleys of Transylvania and Wallachia, the landscape still bore their imprint. Ancient roads guided new migrations. Ruined fortresses became foundations for early medieval strongholds. The stones of Samizegatusa were scavenged to build monasteries and peasant homes, yet the name lingered in songs, whispered as the Mountain of the Old Kings. Travelers crossing the region in later centuries would hear stories of a buried city of gold, guarded by spirits who once fought the Romans and now slept beneath the soil. Memory had turned to myth, but myth preserved truth more faithfully than any chronicle. Christianity deepened the transformation, but did not erase the past. The first bishops north of the Danube preached in Latin, baptizing converts who already knew the language of the Gospels. Crosses rose where the altars of Zalmoxis had stood, but the mountains remained sacred. Pilgrims still climbed to peaks for prayer, lighting fires that could be seen for miles. In those flames glimmered the fusion of two worlds, the faith of empire and the spirit of the old god who had promised immortality to his people. By the 7th century, the idea of Dacia had long vanished from political maps, yet it survived in imagination. Byzantine geographers continued to label the lands north of the river as Dacia, as if refusing to admit that Rome's dominion there had ended. To them, the name signified a dream of continuity, proof that empire could outlast empire through the persistence of culture. And in a quiet, unrecorded way, it was true. The mountain villages still spoke Latin, the same language now chanted in distant cathedrals of Gaul and Italy. The empire had fallen, but its tongue, and through it, the Dacian memory, remained alive. The people who would one day be called Romanians were not yet a nation, not yet even aware of their uniqueness. They lived scattered across hills and rivers, herding, farming, bartering. But in their speech, their prayers, their rituals of harvest and mourning, something ancient breathed. When they invoked the heavens, they used the Latin word for God. When they spoke of their land, They used words descended from the Latin for home. Their ancestors had fought Rome, yet Rome now lived in their mouths. History's irony had become history's inheritance. Beyond their valleys, Europe was stirring into its medieval form. The Franks forged kingdoms in the west. Byzantium held fast in the east. The Avars ruled the steppe between. Through these shifting powers, the Carpathian peoples remained peripheral, their resilience mistaken for obscurity. Chroniclers called them Vlachs, or Romans of the mountains, names given by others, not by themselves. But names mattered less than endurance. They had survived Huns, Goths, and emperors. They would survive the centuries still to come. Trade routes revived along the Danube, carrying furs, salt, and slaves between east and west. Byzantine merchants, hearing the strange Latin dialect of the upland traders, recorded their astonishment that anyone beyond the empire still spoke the tongue of Caesar. The world around them had turned Slavic, Gothic, or Turkic, but these mountain folk clung to the words that once bound them to both Rome and Dacia. Language became resistance, not rebellion, but memory spoken aloud. In legend, the Dacian kings were never truly gone. Peasants told stories of Burebista and Decebalus sleeping beneath the mountains, ready to rise when their land again needed unity. Every fortress ruin became their imagined tomb, every thunderstorm their restless stirring. The old cult of immortality had turned into folklore, a belief not in the endless life of the body, but in the undying endurance of the people themselves. Empires had fallen, but their ancestors, it was said, still watched from the clouds. By the 8th century, the region had entered the long twilight between antiquity and the Middle Ages. Slavic villages dotted the lowlands. Byzantine missionaries journeyed north with icons and psalters. New alliances formed and dissolved like mist. Yet through all of it, the core endured. The mountains, the language, the memory. Dacia no longer existed as a kingdom, but as a continuity. It was not a place anymore, but a presence. What Rome had built in stone, the Dacians rebuilt in spirit. Their legacy was not an empire, but a resilience that carried through centuries of chaos. In their faith, the old gods had not entirely died. They had been baptized and transformed. In their speech, Latin had not conquered, it had merged. In their endurance, identity had not vanished, it had evolved. The Dacians had lost their name, yet in losing it, they had gained something greater, a place in the bloodstream of Europe. When the chroniclers of later centuries wrote of these lands, they spoke of mystery, a people who seemed Roman, yet were not, ancient, yet reborn. They could not see the lineage clearly, but the mountains knew. Beneath every ruined wall, beneath every carved stone reused in a church or farmhouse, slept the same unbroken spirit that had once defied Trajan and prayed to Zalmoxis for eternity. In the end, the Dacians' victory was not in war or empire, but in survival. Their story became Europe's hidden continuity, the thread connecting ancient courage to medieval endurance. The mountains kept their secret, the people carried it in their tongues. And somewhere, in the hush of twilight above the Carpathian peaks, one might still imagine the whisper of a promise kept, that no conquest, however absolute, can outlast the voice of those who remember.